And I see someone is calling people from outside, which is good. Okay.
I used to know ED, IMF very well.
Okay, the panel this afternoon will be on reforming the international organizations, potential conflicts, and way forward. My name is Pierre Jacquet. I'm the president of GDN, Global Development Network, an international organization based in Delhi, whose mission is to build research capacity in developing countries. I'm very pleased to chair a very distinguished panel. Let me briefly present, you have the CVs in your folder, but let me briefly present the panelists from right to left. Tom Richardson is the country representative for the IMF senior resident representative here in Delhi. Arvind Virmani is India's former representative to the IMF. On my immediate left, Denis Medvedev is a senior country economist at the World Bank here in Delhi. Heribert is a senior research associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP, I believe, in Berlin. And Cesar Augusto Vermilio Bonamigo is a counselor and deputy chief of mission at the Brazilian embassy here in Delhi as well. So we are lucky enough to have a broad representation of various countries, including, of course, India and Brazil and Russia, central emerging countries as well. And France and Germany, so it's a very nice sample of perspectives. We also are going to cover ground which goes from macro and monetary issues with the IMF to broader development and trade issues in the course of this discussion. But let me start with briefly setting the stage. Let me start with the title, which is Reforming International Organizations, and start just with a question that I think the panelists might want to address, which is whether we are really in a period in which the central issue is to reform international organizations, or whether we need something even more ambitious and broader, which is to think about global politics and how to organize international cooperation. Because it seems to me that any reform of the international organization will be an output of something else. And the way in which this output that we expect from international cooperation is working today is probably not very satisfactory, and there are some deep issues there that we might want to address beyond the nitty-gritty of reform of any specific international organization. As you can notice from the flow of news every day, all the current international organizations are trying to grasp with a very fast-changing situation and environment. The IMF has been discussing a major reform for many years now. It was adopted in 2010 and has still not been ratified. We'll come back to that. The WTO has been trying to put an end to a trade cycle and a trade round, and that was not very successful so far. The World Bank is deeply reforming itself to address development issues in more effective ways. Any organization that exists and was created basically in the past has to face a number of changes, so that what we are discussing today again goes beyond one single organization. It's a deeper evolution that calls for rethinking basically the forces of global politics and how to garner collective action in today's world. Let me start briefly with the IMF reform. With two questions that we might want to address. First, is it the reform that we want? And it is already ambitious, and the sign of that ambition is that it hasn't been adopted yet. And basically what prevents it from being adopted is that we need to have 3/5 of the countries representing 85% of the vote to accept the reform, to ratify the reform. And right now we are not, we are at more than 3/5 of the countries. Actually we have 146 countries that have adopted the reform, the 2010 reform. but that represents only 17.07% and not 85%. And to reach 85%, one absolutely needs the United States, and it is not there. So we can discuss in this room what we need to do to reform, right? Just get the United States to accept that reform. So how do we do it is something that probably is a bit more difficult than agreeing on the solution. So that's one first important aspect of the current debates around the reform. What the reform did basically, and I'm sure that Tom will be more specific than me about that, is to shift part of the voting power to emerging countries from industrial countries, and to make sure that the poor developing countries have more voice in the system. So it's an interesting reform. It's a shift toward developing countries, basically, recognizing the weight of emerging countries much more, and especially the weight of Asia. Asia, in the reform, jumps in terms of voting power quite significantly. There is also a doubling of quotas that is part of that reform, and that doubling of quotas will be valid only when the reform of the amendment has been accepted as well. So in a way, we need that agreement on the amendment of the Articles of Agreement and the governance of the board in order to unleash the decision to double the quotas. Let me move from that to, since it is in the subject that was assigned to this panel, to the international monetary system. And let me, instead of focusing on the technicalities, remind you what an international monetary system is about. Basically, there are three broad functions that it does. One is to organize the exchange of currencies, to allow the exchange of various currencies through an exchange rate mechanism. And then you can imagine you can have a debate about the technicalities of any possible exchange rate mechanism, from pure fixity to pure floating, going through all intermediate stage of managed floating or organized floating or organized fixity or flexible flexity. The second thing that an international monetary system does is to organize the systems of payments. And that's basically about maintaining convertibility. Convertibility is a technical word that means basically exchanging one currency for another for specific types of transaction. So full convertibility will allow any kind of transaction. Current account convertibility will allow only transactions on current spending and exports, imports, and transfers. So that's something that an international monetary system has to do, is to organize the systems of payments and define the nature of the transactions that will be easily conducted under the systems of payments. The third is that whenever the exchange rates are not fully floating, which characterize the current situation, you need an asset that you will be willing to hold in order to finance the existing imbalances. And that asset is called international liquidity. It can be one asset, it can be several assets. It can be goods, it can be currencies, it can be a basket of currencies, a basket of goods. So technically there are many choices possible. But anytime we discuss about the international monetary system, we'll go back to these three items and we have a debate either on the nature of the exchange rate system or on the nature of convertibility, whether the flow of goods and services or flow of capital is free or not, and in which case it is free, and whether imbalances should be financed or should lead to adjustment, and finally the choice of international liquidity. And that's a constant of history. Each time the debate was there on the international monetary system, these three questions came into the debate. So in a way, we are not reinventing the wheel here when we are discussing about that, and it's useful to go back in history about these basic problems and see how we address them and whether there is any reason to address them in a way that was different from what happened over the last 20, 30, or 40 years. And there is a constant there, which is called the impossible trinity, or in many it can have several names. The Mundell impossible triangle. It is a simple idea that there are three things that you might think are desirable, but you can't have simultaneously, or you can have, but it's then an unstable situation full of repeating crises. One is full capital mobility. The second one is fixed exchange rates. And the third one is full national autonomy of monetary policy. And a big question is which of these three should go? And to what extent is it necessary for that thing to go? And again, there are a number of intermediary systems that basically we can't have the three together. So that gives some depth to some of the debates that we have about, for example, stabilizing the dollar and the euro. Very often one sees that in the press and everywhere. Well, stabilizing the dollar and the euro is very, very simple in a world of full capital mobility. You just need to have a very formal agreement between the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve. I like to imagine the kind of political environment that would be needed for that to happen. Okay, so part of the debate, if one goes back to this impossible triangle, is in fact rather straightforward. Let me end with an observation on international reserves. There is a lot of debate about the role of the SDR, and I don't want to take position at this stage. I think that our panel will probably want to say a few things about it. But let me just insist that right now the SDR, the special drawing right, is not a currency. It is a mechanism to allow countries to access world currencies for financing reasons. And therefore it is a mechanism that creates an acceptable form of international liquidity. Technically, it is a basket of currencies. Its value is computed as a basket. The interest rate on holdings of SDRs is computed as a weighted average of the interest rates on short-term debt instruments denominated in the currencies of the basket, and so on. So any vision that sees the SDR as emerging as a world currency needs first to explain how to transform it in a currency. And this is something that is not in the current definition of the SDR. So a few questions for the panel. Is this IMF reform going far enough? And if yes, how do we manage its entry into force? How can we help the process? If we think it's not enough, what kind of alternative would we have in mind that would reflect the world economy? Is it a system in which we have several regional institutions? And the debate is also about the creation of some of them, notably the BRICS bank and so on. The second set of questions is what are the major issues in the international monetary and economic system that deserve attention? And that goes to the international monetary system and trade in goods and services as well, and development. So all three major issues are there. How much of this is a problem of reforming the institutions, so a technical problem, as opposed to a more deeper political problem? And then, since this is a G20 conference, what is the role of the G20? We invoke the G20 in many respects. There is not enough probably consideration about what the G20 can do usefully, and it would be useful on this series of issues to highlight how the G20 might help. So let me stop there and give the floor first to Tom Richardson for the IMF.
Thanks very much, Pierre. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this panel, to this group. I've been to the ICRIER G20 conference now for 3 years in a row. I think it's quite an important venue and opportunity to discuss G20 issues in India, which is, obviously one of the key G20 members, and given demographic trends will ultimately be one of the largest, if not the largest, of the G20 countries. So I think it's very important that we continue this process. I'm going to be brief because some of the issues that I have put together in my presentation are ones that Pierre has talked about, and I think that Dr. Virmani will also raise them. So I'm going to go through just enough to kind of set the stage for thinking about thinking about IMF reform at the governance level. I mean, one thing I should say, though, is that it's really clear to all of us working at the IMF that this issue of reforming the governance of the IMF is crucial to ensuring that we retain or regain some legitimacy in the international system. I mean, I think that's one of the key motivations. And at the level of staff, at the level of management, I think at the level of the board, member governments, there's a wide spread understanding that without some reform, shift of voting power inside the IMF as an institution will lose legitimacy globally. I won't go through this. This is kind of a propaganda slide, but this one will put you all to sleep because it's how the international, the IMF system is run. I thought about it. It's a bit like, you know, if I were a magician or a hypnotist, right? And I held up a watch and held the watch back and forth. After about 2 minutes of staring at this slide, you'll all be asleep. The basic point is we are run by the member governments that own the IMF, which is 188 countries. They have constituted a board of governors which nominates a ministerial level committee called the IMFC, the International Monetary and Financial Committee, which, like the Development Committee, which has an analogous role at the World Bank, basically meets twice a year and runs the IMF at that executive level. At the operational level, at the more pragmatic day-to-day level, we have a resident board of 24 members with alternates and representatives from almost all of the 188 member countries, which sits in Washington, meets 3 times a week, and which hires our managing director and our management staff, the top tier of 4 or 5 people who run the IMF. And they hire the rest of us. So I'm down in this bottom tier here. I'm one of the staff members. And we make a pretty firm distinction between the IMF staff and our management level and the board. So I can speak typically on behalf of the staff, but I wouldn't presume normally without the endorsement of our board to speak on behalf of the board, because there is some endorsement of the international system at that level. This is where the IMF board sits on the 12th floor of our building in Washington. Voting power, although there are 24 members, they don't have equal votes. I mean, 24 members sit at the table and effectively cast votes for all 188 countries with the voting power governed by quota share. And this is where it gets interesting. The quota formula, I'm not going to go through this. It's broadly based on GDP, but a mix of PPP GDP and market exchange rate GDP, as well as some other variables, including the amount of reserves countries have, the amount of openness, and so forth. I think Dr. Ramani will talk about this as well, and the different formulas and possibilities for making a rules-based system work in this way. So I'm not going to go through that. I will say, though, that we, as Pierre mentioned, we, our betters, our masters, approved in 2010 a review of the quotas, which was meant to both increase the size of the IMF, the kind of lendable resources, by about 2-fold, and also shift a significant amount of voting resources away from industrialized countries that had, been the biggest countries in the world when the IMF was created back in the middle part of the last century, towards dynamic emerging market and developing economies, but particularly emerging market economies. So in practice, what we say is that it shifts, this reform would shift about 6% of voting power to those underrepresented, or countries that before the reform would have been underrepresented members, while trying to protect the voting power of the poorest, particularly African countries. If we just did it based on market GDP rates, ratios, then frankly, African countries would lose voting power substantially. And they're already, on a population basis, they look relatively underrepresented. There are a couple of other reforms at the time that were proposed, including changing a bit the way the IMF board operates. I mean, many countries are in the IMF board in elected constituencies, including India, right, which has a couple of other countries in that constituency. And the idea was that the director should be elected, and also that European countries, which again were the largest, or were among the largest economies at the time the IMF was formed, but no longer have that same share in the global economy, would give up a couple of seats at the board to create room for additional emerging market and developing economies. That reform, I should say, I mean, although we talk about the 6% shift of voting power, in practice, the shift is a little bit less. I mean, if you think about it as a whole, emerging market and developing economies would gain a little bit less than 3% of voting power. And that's partly because some emerging market economies would give up power, give up voting share in favor of others. And you can see that easier in the next slide, right? Where you can see which countries get more, which countries get less. This is just selective, right? It's not for all countries. It just happens to be a list of countries that I plucked out of the tables. You can see obviously India would get a little bit more power. China would be the big winner. They would get a significant increasing voting power. Some European countries would get less voting power. But also South Africa would lose some voting power. And a couple of other emerging market economies would give up voting power. And that's because their share in the global economy hasn't grown as fast as others, right? Particularly China, which has grown extraordinarily rapidly. So I make that point to be clear. What's holding things up? It's no secret. There's one big country. And I should say, truth in advertising, I'm an American citizen. I'm working for the IMF. So I'm not standing before you as an American, but I'm an American anyway. And as an American, I was kind of proud, frankly, back in 2010 when the Americans pushed really hard against some resistance from Europe, to shift voting power in the IMF. Because again, as an IMF staff member, I feel like this is really an important thing to make the institution continue to be relevant for the future. And then it's just embarrassing. I mean, this is my, again, personal view. It's embarrassing that now it's the U.S. that is holding up the reform. And it's because, as Montek said Wednesday night, it's because Congress, although the administration has put it forward, the Congress has not yet voted for it. So then this slide I won't belabor, but I put the photo of Keynes and Harry Dexter White on the screen because I think it's a little bit relevant in the sense that when the fund was created, this threshold of having to have an 85% majority to do any kind of reform like this was established clearly at the same time as the U.S. voting power of about 17% was established. So the U.S. was given effectively a veto over substantial changes in the IMF. And the guy who's responsible is this guy, Harry Dexter White. If you have not been to the beach yet this summer, a great book to take with you is a book by Ben Stile called The Battle of Bretton Woods, which discusses exactly how we ended up where we are here. Okay, so that's just by way of background. I do think, though, that it's important that the next review, we're meant to review quotas every 5 years. And the 14th review is already supposed to be long done, and we're meant to be sorting out the 15th review of quotas. They pushed it back by a year, and the deadline now is January of 2015, and I don't think anybody realistically expects it to be done by then. So I think we do have this challenge of maintaining the legitimacy of an institution like the fund, which, for better or worse, has had a fairly substantial role in dealing with crises when they have arisen. Okay. So 2 last slides. Does the delay in passing the 14th quota reform mean that the fund is out of bullets? The answer is no. In the interim, I mean, one thing that happened in the run-up to the 14th quota review was that basically the IMF was given additional access to borrowing from member central banks to make sure that our lendable resources remain relevant to the size of the challenge that we face. That's the new arrangements to borrow, the NAB. So those lendable resources, I think, are substantial and are adequate to the challenge. Although that's something that one can debate, right? Once the 14th quota review is completed, then this NAB will be rolled back, and it will be, the lendable resources of the fund will be increased on a more permanent basis. The last slide I want to raise is about the BRICS Bank, in particular the BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement, which is a regional, effectively like a swap arrangement that looks a lot like the IMF, and it raises some questions, I think legitimate questions for how the IMF should operate. I think Pierre raised some good questions about the integrity or the unity of the international system. We actually think this is a good idea, right? We supported the Chiang Mai Multilateralization Initiative. We think that initiatives like this are a good thing. Anything that bolsters the firewall against international contagion, financial sector contagion, makes the international financial system more durable, and that's the objective at the end of the day. So it doesn't have to be us doing this stuff. We have expressed willingness to work with the BRICS on setting up the institution, how it should work, and so forth. And we just fully support the BRICS Bank and the contingent reserve arrangement. So I just wanted to make that clear. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Tom. Let me now give the floor to Dr. Virmani.
Okay, so just to clarify, I was the executive director at the IMF from 2009 to 2012, representing India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan, not just India. So I'm going to talk about basically about the link between global governance and reform of the quota in the IMF. Let me skip all this introduction and go straight to the point, because we have only about 10 to 15 minutes, right? So the basic problem is represented in this graph, which is a small note I wrote in Vox EU some years ago. And this graph shows you the difference between share of the world economy of different countries and their quota shares in the IMF. The problem is much worse in the World Bank. And you notice that all the countries the interesting one actually is that the USA was not much of a problem. Its quota share is actually less than its share in world GDP, which is why US actually, the government has been very supportive. The problem is really Congress and the gridlock in Congress. I'll leave that aside. It's not really a problem of the US as represented by its government at all. And I worked closely with them while I was there. So see the ones which are where the GDP share is greater is China, India, Russia marginally, and Brazil. Now, all those who talk about BRICS as if it's just a figment of the imagination of Goldman Sachs really miss the basic point. These are the 4 largest countries which are underrepresented in the global governance structure. That's the simple point of this graph here. And that is the fundamental problem which affects everything. I gave a seminar at Brookings once, a part of which you'll see here. And the question was, why are quotas so important? Well, they determine the whole government structure, or governance structure of the IMF, how the staff react. I'm sure the staff will say we are very independent, we are very logical and all that, but I'll give you one example later. So that is a position as it is. If you look forward into the future, the thing gets even worse. And these are few graphs which show that. This is a graph of the US share of world economy or the US economy or various countries relative to the US. That's why on the left you have 100% means equal to the US. And you can see the broad picture here, China's rapid rise, which we are now all familiar with, which one has been talking about for a long time, and the orange line, which is India, and the relative decline of Japan. Not very large, small decline, that also creates a problem. All these things have relevance in the discussions we had in the IMF, the declining powers and the rising powers. And that's again telling you that the governance problem is going to get more and more serious, that the share, unless the quota reform, which is now held up, the last one, the new one didn't even take place. Just to give a more detailed picture, again, you will see Brazil is hard to make out, but the fundamental thing which strikes you here is the last line out there, Italy. I didn't point out in the graph earlier, but Italy's share now in governance is much, much higher than its GDP share. And that's a fundamental problem. And that's where the whole power of the EU and Europe comes in. They protect their own countries. Okay? It's not Italy out there alone. It's the EU. So what are the principles? You know, I wrote a paper when we were discussing the last reforms, and you know, we got into endless debates. So I said, is there a way of cutting through these debates where everybody's arguing and bringing up their own variables? Are there any principles? So I'm going to give you a set of 3 principles, which is my basic talk here. and then give you a little few graphs and things to just illustrate. So here are some traditional principles which I call set A. One country, one vote. This is the principle in the UN General Assembly. For those of you who follow the General Assembly know that it's a Babel, doesn't work. The one country, one, it's very nice, it sounds good, that's the basis on which the UN was set up, but it doesn't work, it doesn't produce anything useful. I'm sorry to be so strong about it.